Good morning. It's still morning, everybody. I'm glad you're all here. We're going to talk today about healthy and happy habits, and it's something that I have felt passionately about for many, many years and talk about this as often as I can. So I'm glad that you are all here today to have this discussion. Just before any workshop that I give, I always like to make sure that we are having time to talk about the resources that Blomquist Health offers. If you are here at one of our workshops, you're familiar with our benefit, but I also want to make sure that people are reminded that we all go through difficult life events. And in addition to these workshops that we offer, we do have our regular outpatient mental health counseling that is free and confidential for you and family members that live in the home with you in the majority of the cases and companies that we work with. We are able to help with a wide variety of difficult life issues. And research shows that 1 out of 5 people will have a difficult life event at the beginning or in any given year. And that can be anything from mental health, depression, relationship issues, phase of life changes, anything that may be going on. There are lots of reasons why someone might need support. I like to tell people that there's no issue too big or too small to use our services. In fact, one time I had someone come in and they just wanted a neutral third party to talk about if they should get dog number 3. And you know what? If that's a stressful life event for you, great. Please come in and let us be that support for you. If only all of life's issues were that was the most stressful thing in our life would be pretty good. But we're also here for all of those other difficult life events that may be going on as well. I have been working with Blomquist Hale for many years, since 2014, and really feel strongly about the good services that we offer and hope that you will utilize our service for this aspect as well if needed. All right, but jumping into our topic today, I want to talk about what healthy habits are. And when we think about what a healthy habit is, we often think about the standards, right? Diet, exercise, having a good routine and organization. And those are all incredibly important. When we look at the wellness of a person, we talk about, a balanced person having balance with our emotional well-being, our physical well-being, our intellectual well-being, and so forth, right? And what I want to talk about today, there's a lot of information out there on how to establish healthy habits when it comes to diet, exercise, and organization. And we are, as therapists here at Blomquist Health, are happy to help you with those things as well. But what I wanted to spend most of our focus today on was talking about what are daily mental health habits that you can engage in to help you have a better and healthier life. We know that getting a good amount of sleep helps us have the energy, it helps fight off inflammation, helps us function better in the day. We know the impact of sugar and bad diet and fast food on our well-being as well, on not only our physical well-being and on our emotional well-being. More and more evidence is out there saying that the type of foods we eat have an impact on our mental health well-being as well. And we can, you can hardly open the news without hearing articles about exercise and the importance that exercise can have. But what about those daily mental health habits? What are those things that we do every day that keep our brain in a place where we are more open to receiving the good that's in the world and keep us built and strong for the challenges that may come our way? So I'm going to start out first by talking a little bit about the things that maybe get in the way. So we know that happiness has been a discussion that has been going on since the beginning of time. I've got quotes here by Abraham Lincoln, by Socrates, by Gandhi, about different philosophies that people have had over the centuries on what brings happiness. Socrates, thousands of years ago, said, "He is richest who is content with the least, for contentment is the wealth of nature." Gandhi has said, "Happiness is when what you think, what you say, and what you do are in harmony." And then Abraham Lincoln, I think, who is an interesting person to have this quote, "Folks are usually about as happy as they make up their mind to be." which I think says a lot's coming from someone like Abraham Lincoln, who more and more researchers today think that he likely, probably himself, dealt with serious depression. He talks about his history. There was a great documentary on PBS several years ago about Abraham Lincoln and his likely mental health issues, and talked about how when he went through a breakup when he was in his young 20s, lost his mother, and all of these things led to him feeling quite depressed and at times suicidal. There was a time where he felt that his friends were quite concerned for his safety. And knowing in the White House that he lost children and was the head of a country during a very, very violent civil war, that he dealt with quite a bit. So I think that's an interesting quote coming from him. But when we think about our world and we think about where our brain is spending its energy, what are we spending time thinking about? Where are we putting our energy? If we're spending our time thinking about all of the awful conflicts that are happening around the world, and there's some really awful things. It's hard not to care about what's happening in Iran right now, or what's happening in Ukraine. There are some awful things in Syria and all of these other countries that are going through awful things that can really have an impact. But this picture can also represent things like, how are we spending our time? Are we watching, when we're at the end of the day, are we playing pretty dark and violent video games? Are we watching really dark and depressing things? And the world also always has some kind of natural disaster happening somewhere. I know just recently there was another hurricane that hit Florida over the weekend. I feel like Utah and the United States was spared from awful wildfires this summer, but something that there's always some kind of natural disaster that we're concerned about that may impact us greatly. I have a sister that lives in Tornado Alley and is regularly concerned about that. And then we have politics, right? We have the politics, regardless of which party or which side you are on, is quite stressful. And there can be a lot of conflict associated with that. And if not only with that, but if we think everyone in the world is untrustworthy, not someone that we can believe in, that can really have an impact on our worldview. Then there's breaking news. How many of us spend our days after work or during the day? We get those KSL news alerts or CNN or Fox News alerts that tell us the things that are happening around the world. And how often are they actually positive things? How often are they filled with really difficult and sad or just distressing information? And then there's, when we're take away the world events that are happening around us, what about our micro world that we are, our community that we're in? How often when we're driving to work, are we focusing on that person who is a bad driver? Maybe we're annoyed with that neighbor who hasn't raked up their leaves yet. And we are focusing on all of just the negative things around us, the things that are happening, the negative things that people are saying. And when we think about that, what kind of an impact does that have on our worldview? If we're spending all of our time focusing on all of the difficult, hard, and heartbreaking things, how does that change the way we see each other and the world around us? And how does it impact our choices? If all of our time is, and I want to be clear that sometimes our own individual life circumstances make it so that it is hard and things are out of our control. And we don't want this depression or this divorce or this medical condition that we've been diagnosed with. And that does make things hard. And sometimes these things are out of our control and it just feels heavy. But when we do spend all of our time focusing on those things, how does that impact the choices that we make? I knew one individual who hadn't been as successful in dating as they would like. And their point of view had changed into, all of my dates dumped me, so why accept this date offer? Or maybe sometimes we have this idea of, I failed at every other diet that I've had, what's the point in trying now? And the choices that we make, why should I even apply for this job? I've not had good experiences anywhere else I've worked, why try? Then we have this idea of a confirmation bias. The confirmation bias, as you see in this picture here, there's lots of yeses all over this picture. But somehow someone has found a way to find a no in there. And that's what a confirmation bias is. It's the tendency to interpret new evidence as a confirmation of our existing beliefs or theories. So if I want to find something negative and something positive, I can find that. If I want to find evidence that something is bad, I can find that too. I see confirmation bias happen a lot when it comes to politics. If I want to believe that my political party is the best and the other one is the worst, I will gather all the evidence I can that supports that idea that my political party is the best and discount anything that doesn't quite fit that narrative. And vice versa, then I'll gather all the evidence I can on why the opposite political party is the worst and discount anything that might actually fit within my belief system. With this confirmation bias, we can do this in marriages. If I want to believe my spouse is the worst person on the planet, I'll sure pay attention to all those socks on the floor, the dishes they didn't put away. Or if I want to gather all the evidence I can that my spouse is the greatest, again, I'm more likely to find evidence that supports that too. And what does all of this do to our brain? If we are spending all of our time focusing on the negative events that are happening in the world, the negative thing our coworkers said, all of the bad news that's happening on the TV when we turn on the TV at the end of the day, what does this do to our brains? This beautiful picture here is a picture of the neural pathways in the brain. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the neural pathways and how the brain works, but the neural pathways are the habits, the little pathways in our brain that are our habits. So, one of these neural pathways might represent our bedtime routine. Another one might represent our childhood phone number or other information that we're storing or habits that we engage in every day. You might recognize this. Have you ever, do you have a recipe, a favorite recipe that you have made a million times so you don't even have to pull out the recipe and read it anymore for the measurements? That's likely because we've done it enough that our brain has formed a neural pathway. So when we start to pull, for me, it would be my chocolate chip cookie recipe. When I start to pull out the chocolate chips, my brain's like, oh yeah, let's make sure we're getting that butter to room temperature, and goes through all of those other steps because it's done it so many times that it knows what to do. Another example of this would be our commute home. If you've lived in the same place for a little while, you probably don't have to think too hard about which roads you need to take to get home. Because our brain has done it so many times that it just goes on autopilot. In fact, sometimes you might notice that if you have a longer commute and is barring any major traffic or accidents or things like that, your brain can go on autopilot and doesn't really have to think too much about how you're going to get there. I used to work in our Ogden office for many years. I now work in our downtown Salt Lake City office, but I lived in Salt Lake at the time. So my commute, I knew that I would turn right, get on Highway 89 and head south to I-15. And, sometimes during that commute home, my spouse would call me and say, hey, where are you? And it's not that I wasn't paying attention to the road. It's just that my brain knew that I had quite a ways until my next exit. And so my brain would be problem solving, doing all sorts of other things, thinking about what I was going to do with the evening, decompressing from maybe the therapy sessions I was holding that day, because it knew that I had a while to go, so it could put its energy elsewhere. And so when my husband would ask me where I was, I'd sometimes have to think a little bit for a minute and be like, oh, I don't know. Because I knew instinctively my brain had created this neural pathway that I didn't have to worry about getting over to my exit lane for a little while longer. And our brain creates those neural pathways for that reason in particular, so that we can create these habits and energy can be spent doing other things like problem solving or planning or other things that are taking up our energy in that moment. But you can imagine if we are spending all of our time focusing on some of the negative things that are happening, that we are unintentionally creating these neural pathways in the brain to automatically scan the world to look for the negative. And you can see what an impact that might have on our overall well-being. And as I talk about this, I want to be very clear. If we're dealing with depression or anxiety or other things, these are tips and tools that we will get to in a little while that can definitely have an impact that help. But we also need to be mindful that sometimes our brain, if we are dealing with depression or other mental health issues, it can have a tendency and it's on its own to focus on some of the hard things and can be harder to focus on some of the balance. And I also want to be clear here that if you are going through a really hard time, I am not saying that we shouldn't just ignore those and only focus on the positive. I feel like this might date me, but there was an old movie called Pollyanna back in the days. I think it was based on a book, and it was an old Disney movie made in the 60s, 50s or 60s about this young woman who goes and she moves into an old, with her older aunt and makes this whole town from a grumpy place to a really happy place by just saying everything is great and wonderful. And at one point she falls out of a window and is paralyzed. And the whole town is like, you helped us be happy. Don't be sad that you're paralyzed. And I think that's really weird, right? When we go through really hard times, of course we're going to be sad about it. And of course we're going to be upset as well. And if we're going through a depression or a breakup or the loss of someone that we hold dear, of course we're going to be sad. But we also want to make sure that we're creating balance in our world so that those things don't also always consume us or overwhelm us. And as we also talk about these things, this is a study that it's one of those no-brainer studies that I can't believe they got funding to do. But the Warsaw School of Social Psychology did a study on thinking negatively, and their outcomes showed that thinking negatively is correlated with having lower moods, negative emotions, decreased life satisfaction, decreased optimism, and obviously emotional and motivational deficits. I don't think that would really shock anyone, the results of that study. And so then I think we spend a lot of time thinking about what are things that we can do to find more happiness in our life. And sometimes that's always a noble quest, I think, but sometimes we go about it the wrong way. And one of the things that we do is we fall in for these happiness myths and traps, things that we think will bring happiness, but don't. A life of leisure. I mean, this picture of laying on a beach somewhere in the tropics sounds so lovely. But again, research shows that if we don't have some type of purpose and we have no kind of something to keep us going, that can lead to lower life satisfaction. Status, getting that job or getting that meeting some kind of social status or acceptance doesn't necessarily bring happiness. Possessions, we think, getting that new car, that new house. But again, what research shows is that that can bring some temporary joy, but that fades pretty quickly. Financial security. There are research studies that show that once a person makes over a certain amount of money, their happiness does not increase any. And the number is pretty reasonable. This may have been updated for inflation and other things. The study I read was probably 4 or 5 years ago. But the number was somewhere around $75,000. And anything you make above that does not increase your happiness long term. And so we think that, we think that those things will bring us happiness, and they may help with some things, but long term, they don't bring lasting happiness. Other myths that we fall into: Shangri-La, happiness is somewhere else. Or I'll be happy if I get that new job. But again, that can be similar to Shangri-La happiness, right? I get that new job somewhere else, my problems will disappear. Or once my kids grow up, once I have kids, once I get married, once I get divorced, once I get that new house, we think that once we achieve something, that will bring us happiness. And that is something that I think we have to be mindful of, that again, those things can be helpful in our life, but they don't necessarily solve any of our problems. And oftentimes they can create new ones. Maybe it's like, once I get that new house, then I'll feel happy. But then with that comes maybe higher mortgage payments and more fix-it projects around the house. And oh no, that sewer line just broke, or whatever it may be. There are always consequences and always things that bring challenges to that. So this is something then, is what does bring happiness. And this is a research study done by Sonia Lubomirsky. She is a researcher out of, I think, UC Davis. And forgive me if I know she's part of the UC system in California. Forgive me if I get the wrong university. And she is a positive psychologist. And what positive psychologists do is, instead of focusing on what's wrong with people, they focus on what's right with people. Instead of what are all of the, and we can't just ignore the hard things, but instead the focus switches to what's right with people. What skills do people already have that help them get through those hard things? How do we focus on strengths? And that's where she's put a lot of her studies. This research study that she did, you can find in her book, Pursuing Happiness. And she has found that there are 3 different factors that influence chronic happiness levels. The first is 50% of our happiness comes from our genetic tendencies. And that is something that we can't deny. We can't deny that our happiness can sometimes come from, sometimes some of us are genetically born with tendencies towards anxiety or depression or bipolar disorder. And that's something that we can't control and did nothing wrong, but something that we may have inherited or were born with. Other times, and I'll often hear this from young parents, they'll say, my children are so different. My 4-year-old is super positive and always problem solving. My 2-year-old is just a lot more grumpy and negative. Sometimes we're born with that genetic tendency to be more optimistic or have a positive outlook, and sometimes not. We can't discount the genetic impact that plays a role in our personality. The next part, 10% of our overall happiness, comes from circumstances. Now, what I find interesting is what often happens for people is they put all of their energy into their circumstances. Again, those are those happiness myths we saw on the previous slides. I'll be happy if this happens. I'll be happy when that happens. I'll be happy, if I get that pay raise, if this conflict resolves with this person in my life. And those do play a role. But as you see, according to her research, only 10% of our overall happiness. Now, this remaining 40%, I think, is the most interesting. It is, what are the intentional activities or choices that we make is the remaining 40% of our overall happiness. So I find this really optimistic, because maybe our genetic tendencies are not in our favor, and maybe our circumstances aren't great either. But that remaining 40%, regardless of our genetics or our circumstances, tells us that we can choose or engage in certain activities that lead to chronic happiness. And to me, that's really encouraging, that even if maybe we are dealing with depression, there are still things and choices we can make that can lead to more happiness. When I think about this, I think about Viktor Frankel. When I think about that 40% of happiness that is in our hands, if you will, I think of his experience. And for those of you that aren't familiar with him, Viktor Frankel was a prominent doctor in Austria in the 1940s and 30s and 40s. He wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. But prior to writing that book, he was a young doctor. He was studying neurology, and he was writing a different book. He was married, and his wife was expecting their first child. And he had a lovely medical practice, good relationship with his parents, a nice home. But as he was Jewish in the 1930s and 40s, and in Austria, his life was at risk because the Nazis determined he had no worth. And they took away his medical license, his home, and every possession he had. And they took him and his wife his parents and his sister, and put them in different concentration camps. And he had been in his own concentration camp for a short period of time when he found out that his pregnant wife and his parents had been murdered immediately upon arriving at their camps. And when he arrived at the concentration camp he was placed in, he had put his copy of his book, the typewriter written and handwritten version that he was working on, and immediately burned it. So at this point, he had nothing. And that can be really really discouraging. And if you read his book, Man's Search for Meaning, he talks about how it wasn't like all butterflies and rainbows, and that it was just one of the most awful experiences that he ever went through. And there were times where he really considered giving up. But as he thought through this experience, he came to this place where he, being a doctor and being a social scientist, was curious about how people were getting through this horrific, awful thing. And he found that those that have found some kind of purpose may have been treated just as poorly as everyone else and been restricted with food and beaten and all have gone on marches, but they somehow seemed to get by better and survived longer. And he found this, he came up with this idea, and he said, everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And again, like I said, he decided to choose ways to find joy, even in the most awful of circumstances. And like I said earlier, choosing joy didn't mean it minimized the pain that being in his concentration camp brought. But it also meant that he still found joy even in the darkest of situations. And he talks about doing that through things like helping out a fellow bunkmate, providing support for other people in the camps, listening to a beautiful songbird outside of their window, or reliving the memories of the time he had with his wife. And I can't imagine that was easy for him to do. And like I said, it doesn't in any way, it's not this Pollyanna where everything's beautiful and let's just pretend we're in a beautiful place. That's not what he writes about. That's not what his experience was. But he created this balance saying, they can take everything from me, but I am not going to give the Nazis the power over my freedom to still find joy despite all of their efforts to destroy me. It's a pretty powerful point of view. And these are a couple of other quotes from his book. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. And this is something that I use in therapy all the time with people. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and freedom. Sometimes the world can feel very heavy and there can be a lot of really difficult things going on. But again, going back to that slide, 40% of our overall happiness can come from the choices we make and the decisions we do to try to find more joy in our lives. So then what are some of these happy habits that we can do on a daily basis to utilize that 40%, to create habits that every day we are trying to find that balance in our lives so that the negative and the harsh and the hard doesn't take over? So there's another researcher who has taken the studies of Sonia Lyubomirsky and built on those. He said, okay, if 40% of our overall happiness comes from choice, what are things that we can do every day that release those serotonins, those dopamines, the oxytocins, endorphins, all of those feel-good chemicals in our brain, so that our brain is releasing more of those happy chemicals more often? And his name is Sean Achor. He is a researcher out of Harvard, and he's got a wonderful TED Talk that if you are interested in learning more about his research that you can find online. Sean Achor, it's like anchor without the N. And he has dedicated his career to saying, well, what are these things that we can do to produce those feel-good chemicals in our brain? And he comes up with 5 things, and these 5 things are pretty doable. You'll find that most of them can be done at your desk or at bed before you go to sleep at night, or while you're driving home. And they're things that, again, his research shows that if we do these 5 things every single day, what we're then doing is creating neural pathways in our brain to develop healthy habits. So our brain is looking for and scanning the world for the good. So we have more balance in our lives. And he talks about doing each of these 5 things for at least 21 days, because that's how long research takes. It shows that the real research shows it takes anywhere between 21 and about 45 days for a new habit to be formed, or a new neural pathway in our brain to be formed, so that these behaviors become second nature. Just like my commute home, I don't have to think too hard about how I'm going to get home. Doing these things every day will create a neural pathway, so I don't have to think too hard, and my brain is automatically doing these things every day. So let's jump in and talk about what each of those things are. The first one is 3 acts of gratitude. Now, when Sean Ahor did this with the employees of Google, he asked them to write down 3 things they were grateful for every day for 21 days, and he would be back, and he would he would see how it went. And so he did. He came back 21 days later and asked the employees how it went, and they were like, "Yeah, it was okay." And a little confused, he said, "Well, let me see your lists." And he pulled out, and almost everyone, out of all of the thousands of people at Google, they'd all written almost the exact same thing every single day. I'm grateful for my job. I'm grateful for my health. I'm grateful for my family. And there were some variations in there for between people, and then they would write the same thing every day for 21 days. And you can imagine then that just becomes noise in the brain. Just becomes a to-do list. If this is the time I say I'm grateful for my family, just becomes a task. Where it becomes beneficial is when we come up with unique things every day. I can be grateful for my family every day, but make it something different. Why am I grateful for them today? And they also don't have to be huge monumental things. I can be grateful that my neighbor, this is very sweet of her, she brought me over some leaf bags because she saw that she went and picked them up for herself and saw that we would need them at our own home. Something small to be grateful for. I could be grateful for my family every day, but maybe today I'm grateful that we don't have anything big planned on our schedule tonight. So they can be small. They can be something like the traffic was in my favor today, or 7-Eleven has my favorite flavor of Slurpee. We want to come up with as many things, but at least 3 things that we're grateful for each day. This next one he calls the doubler. And what this means is you, for 2 minutes every day, you think of a positive event from the previous day, and you want to go through it with as many details as possible. So you think of the positive event from the previous day, and what his research shows is the brain doesn't know the difference between revisualizing that positive event and the actual event, and re-releases all of those same feel-good chemicals again. So it doesn't have to be a huge thing. It can be a good conversation you had with a colleague or a family member. It could be something along the lines of you watched a funny show and you replay all the parts that made you laugh. It could be you did some fun adventure. And some days are pretty mundane. I think for most of us, we're not typically engaging in a lot of really exciting things every day. If you are, good for you. But oftentimes it can be just something small. Now, if yesterday was a really awful day, pick something else. You can pick a different day. You can replay a very happy memory, a favorite vacation, a happy birthday party, a good conversation with a friend that happened a few years ago, and bullet point all of those things again. Maybe it's your favorite like a wedding day or something along those lines. Replay those with as many details as you can, and the brain will release those same feel-good chemicals again. This next one is the one we can't necessarily do at our desks or on our commute home. And it's what he calls the fun 15. 15 minutes of cardiovascular exercise each day. And again, 15 minutes, hopefully we can all find time to fit in. But even as I say this, I think, oh goodness, I would not consider exercise fun for me. I would not call it the fun 15. But what the research shows is that doing 15 minutes of cardiovascular exercise, whether that's a walk, riding a bike, going for a run, getting on an elliptical, whatever it may be for you, doing some kind of getting your heart rate going for 15 minutes releases so many endorphins and those feel-good chemicals that it has shown to be the equivalent of taking an antidepressant. Now, with that being said, it's not a replacement for antidepressants. There was an article, many of you may have seen it, it's been all over the news the last couple of days, that talk about mindfulness being just as effective for anxiety as anti-anxiety medications. And what it's not saying is that those medications don't work, or that those medications you can just exercise your depression away. But the report is those that exercise report the same benefits as those that take an antidepressant. So again, it doesn't mean you can exercise your depression away. If you're taking your antidepressants, please continue to do so. But exercising reports similar benefits to that. And hopefully there are a lot of creative ways to get that exercise in. I have a colleague that sometimes between therapy sessions, she will run the stairs of our building. Another will just take a walk around the block. Sometimes it could be taking the dog out. And there are lots of different ways to get that exercise in and finding creative ways and times to do that. This next one is breathing and mindful breathing. We're breathing all day long. And sometimes I feel like as a therapist, when we talk about doing deep breathing, it feels a little cliche. But recently I spent several of my days working at in-house at the hospital, one of the hospitals here in Salt Lake. And I was talking with one of the physicians there, and she has made it, one of her research studies has been on mindful breathing. And she told me, she's like, I have found probably hundreds and hundreds of benefits that come from doing deep breathing. It improves accuracy, it decreases stress levels, it burns cortisol, the stress hormones, so that and it reduces inflammation in the body. It helps us concentrate more. It decreases anxiety. She listed so many different things that doing this for just a minute or two a day has positive impacts it has on the body. And then she said, but how I know this, and I study this, and I've read hundreds of articles on this, but how often do I take the time to practice what I preach? We know that doing some deep breathing has a huge impact on our overall well-being. And so there are lots of ways to do it. The first, and I think the easiest way to think about, is we want to be breathing in as deep as we can and exhaling longer than we breathe in. When we exhale longer, what that's doing is it's resetting the nervous system and helping calm down our body from the stresses of the day. It's activating the vagus nerve and other parts of our body to help get us into a more relaxed place. And again, burn some of that cortisol that we are dealing with. Some people have a hard time just focusing on breathing because their brain tends to wander a million different places. So maybe while you're doing that deep breathing, I encourage you to think about, maybe you're thinking about the things you're grateful for while you're doing that and reliving that positive event from the first two steps. I also encourage people to use the 5 senses. What's something you see? Maybe in my office that I'm in now, I have beautiful windows that look out onto the street and lots of trees. So sometimes if I'm feeling stressed, I'll look out my windows and I'll count all of the color green, different colors of green that I see between the different trees and plants and bushes. Maybe it's a matter of counting how many electrical outlets are in your office. I bet you've never counted before unless you've had to, right? Maybe it's listening to the different sounds. Can you hear colleagues through the walls? Do you hear traffic going by? And taking some time, what are something I hear, something I see, something I can smell, taste, and touch? How do my feet feel in my chair? And every time your mind wanders, that's okay. I talked to someone who is a master meditator, and they said it took them, that's all they do for a living is meditate. And they said it took them years of meditating all day, every day to be able to go 1 minute without an intrusive thought. So sometimes it's just a matter of acknowledging those intrusive thoughts, but making sure we're getting that time in to do some of that deep breathing. Now, the last one that he talks about is a random act or a conscious act of kindness. Again, 2 minutes each day doing something nice for someone else. Sometimes when we think about conscious acts of kindness, we think it means like, I've got to go shovel my neighbor's sidewalk, or I've got to weed my neighbor's yard, or spend 4 hours volunteering at the shelter, whatever it may be. And those are all wonderful things too. But sometimes we don't have a lot of time for that as well. And so what Sean Acor talks about is spending 2 minutes of just small things. What he talks about is sending a positive email or a text to a coworker. Thanks for your project, help on this project. I noticed you did a great job on this report. Or it could be something like holding the door open for someone, or smile at people when you pass through the hall. The purpose of this activity is to get ourselves out of our head and out in the world around us. Sometimes, again, when we're focused on the really hard things that are happening to us, we tend to stay isolated in our head, and getting ourselves out and connected with the world around us can help bring balance. So we hopefully, as I go through those 5 steps, you see they're pretty doable, and I bet none of those are shockers or new things to you. We've heard them before. But the hope is, again, that by doing each of these 5 things every day, we are training our brain to create new neural pathways so that without even thinking about it and without trying too hard, our brain is automatically scanning the world for things to be grateful for, positive events from each day. We're taking time to exercise and just get those endorphins going. We are taking time to be mindful and release some of the stress that we're dealing with by doing mindful breathing. And we're getting out of our own heads and connecting with the world around us in some way by training our brain to automatically do those things every day, even when those hard things hit. The hope is these healthy habits will help create balance in our world and provide a soft cushion for us to land on when we are going through some of those hard things. Now, again, these don't solve all of the world's problems. They don't solve all of the hard things we're going through. But the hope is that you can see that some of these activities, again, create that neural pathway to help our brain find a little bit more balance with positive things as well, as so the negative don't just take over. But I also think it's really important to acknowledge that sometimes we still need that additional help and support through counseling or through medication to help us navigate some of those really difficult things. And so my hope is that each of us take a little bit of time to think about the activities that we're engaging in and the thought patterns that we're having in each day to hopefully utilize that 40% of our overall happiness in the best way we can. Sometimes it can be a little easier said than done, and I definitely get that. I'll find myself sometimes after a rough day driving home, and I'll catch my thoughts and think, oh my goodness, I'm mad at every driver that's passing by. I'm frustrated with with X, Y, and Z, and why is this traffic light going on this way? And I think, wait a minute, traffic's okay. Is this worth putting my energy into right now that all of this, there's too much negative. Is there something else I can be putting my energy to instead? And that is my hope, that as we as we finish up this workshop today, that you take a little bit of time and think about how you can intentionally be doing things to find more positivity in each day. Now, these are the list of books that I've used to pull the resources for today. You'll see Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, the book that he wrote after getting out of the concentration camp. What Happy People Know is where we talk about some of the myths of happiness. And then Sonia Lyubomirsky's book, this is where she talks about her research on how she came to this point of discovering this 40% of our overall well-being comes from choice. And then Sean Achor, where he talks about both of these books are wonderful, where he talks about the different activities we can do each day. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and then see if there's any time. We've just got a few minutes left for some conversation or for some questions as well. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts and any questions that you might have. It looks like everybody's saying, it looks like there's everybody saying no questions. That's not a bad thing either. But if there are any questions, I would love to have, this is definitely a place where I'm happy to answer anything that comes up.
Yeah, and while we wait for those to possibly come in, just a reminder, I did record this, so you guys will get this probably by the end of the week. I'll send it out to you via email, so you'll be able to watch it. And with that, we upload all of our videos to YouTube. So I think we have I'm pretty sure we're at 110 plus videos on there now. So all of our previous workshops are on there, so you can go on there and view those too, which can be kind of nice. So watch.
Yeah, it's always good. It's always good to go back and revisit some of these things. As many times as I've talked about these healthy habits, I need the reminder myself to actually continue to do them. So I do see a question that, like, what are those 5 habits each day? The first one is 3 things you are grateful for each day, and they should be different every day. The second one is reliving a positive event from the previous day or from the past, if there's nothing from the previous day, and relive it with as much detail as possible. And the brain releases all of those feel-good serotonins and dopamines when we relive and think about things we're grateful for. 15 minutes of cardiovascular exercise is number 3. Number 4 is 2 minutes of deep mindful breathing. And there are so many great apps. If you even just went to YouTube and did mindful breathing guide or breathing guide, there are lots of little things that can help you. You can even watch while you're doing that deep breathing. And then the 5th one is a random act of service, or random maybe isn't the right word, just an act of service, a conscious act of service for somebody else.